Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 25 of Perfect Inspiration. My name is Brian Matiash. So I was going back and forth whether I should even bring this topic up for Perfect Inspiration, the topic of HDR and tone mapping. And the reason for that is a lot of times whenever those three letters are put together in that particular order, usually a flame war incites. And that's not my goal here. I'm not telling you you have to do it this way or HDR is the end-all be-all or it's, the devil. It's neither. It's a tool. And that's the message here is that HDR is a tool and not a style. So let me illustrate to you what I mean by that. I think a lot of times people end up, or HDR rather, gets a bad rap because it's not used properly. It's used as a styling mechanism and not as a utility. And in the text, you saw that I said you wouldn't use a Phillips screwdriver to apply a coat of paint. That's not the right tool for the job. And so with HDR and tone mapping, that same principle applies. So before I go any further, let's take a quick look here at where this image was taken. I was just outside of Zion National Park, and if we go to the map module in Lightroom, because my camera has a GPS radio sitting in the hot shoe, my Canon, it automatically embeds geotag information. So we wanted to find a place where we could shoot sunset that wasn't in the canyon because the canyon was well in shade before the sun was even close to setting. Because you have these huge canyon walls on either side of you. So we asked one of the workers at Zion National Park, and they gave us this very relatively easy direction to get to this outlook that sits on a butte. And so we were sitting up here somewhere, and we were just shooting, if I zoom out a bit more, basically is shooting into this ridge as the sun was setting. Now, here's the thing. Let's go back to the library view. And so in the grid, we started with this image. So this image is probably what most cameras would have gotten to get the best possible exposure. So if your camera is metering over here and you try to meter for the foreground, because that's the majority of the image, you can see it takes 2/3 of the screen, then you'd get this kind of exposure without any detail in the sky. On the flip side, if you were to meter for the sky, you'd probably get something like this, which if I were to crop really tightly as a panoramic, almost like a widescreen format, that could be cool. But overall, you have no idea really what's over here because most of the exposure has been metered for the very bright sky. And then as we kind of go through, you can see that my camera bracketed 7 exposures and mostly covering the highlights, but we got good shadow information. You can see all that shadow information there. And so what I want to do is I want to tone map. And here is where the crux of this episode lies, is that knowing the tool for the job. For me, I want to have the best of both worlds in this shot. I don't want to use layer masking because I don't feel like I could blend the 2 layers correctly without it looking too artificial. So what I want to do is I'm going to take these 7 exposures and I'm going to tone map them by going to File, plug in Extras, and then selecting Export to Photomatix Pro. All right, so right off the bat, just out of the gate, you can see how much better of an exposure this is. I have beautiful exposure in the sky, foreground. We can refine this. It's a bit too bright for me, but we have information that wasn't there in any given exposure. And again, I use Photomatix Pro as my tone mapping product. This isn't about one product being better than the other. It's up to you to decide. Most companies who make tone mapping products give you a 30-day free trial. So download them and see which one works best for you. So for me here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by bringing up the detail contrast a bit. And then you can see how that immediately wrangles in some of that exposure. I'm going to also bring up some luminosity and I'm going to, the white and black points, I have some room with the white point. I'm looking at my histogram here. And if I undo that for a second, you can see how I have this gap. Let me bring the histogram up. I have a gap. I have room to bring the white point out a bit. So I want to do that. And I'm going to do that by bringing the white point out just a bit until it meets the edge. So somewhere around there is good. Now with that, I'm going to drop the gamma. And I'm getting to that point here where I have a nice evenly exposed image. And just like in the text above, I also usually will make it a bit brighter than normal because when I stylize, and you'll see in a second, stylization tends to darken the image. And so I'm giving myself a bit more of a handicap, some wiggle room, to get a good exposure. So I'm happy here. This looks really good. Let's hit save and re-import to go back to Lightroom for a second. So the image should pop up right over here, and there it is. So let's just take this image and this image. Let's compare the two. So look at the difference. Let's just go into blackout mode, and I'm going to tab out of the columns. And you can see the difference here. I mean, I think we'll all agree that this is a pretty natural looking image. You can see that the hills back here were actually blue. There's blue there. It's not like this is artifacting in color. It's just the blue hills. We have all of these clouds. We have nothing here. So, and we have detail in the shadows, details. We can see all of the brush here. So those are the little things that I think really are where tone mapping and layer blending, these things have a really valid place in digital photography. You know, back in the film days, people incorporated methods of cutting out different exposures to give you full dynamic range. Same thing is going here, just using software. We're using software to go on a pixel by pixel basis through every single exposure to find the best exposure values. That's all we're doing. That's how I approach tone mapping. Not to get a look, not for a style, just as a utility. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish things off here. I'm just going to send this over to Perfect Effects 4 to stylize. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to right click on the image I want to work on, go to Edit In, and select Perfect Effects 4 from the context menu. Alright, so here we are in Perfect Effects 4, and I'm pretty sure this is the first time we're using Perfect Effects 4 on the Inspiration series, so welcome. So we're going to stylize. You can see that the effects categories are moved to the left here instead of the bottom, which took up a lot of real estate. And what I want to do is I want to apply an effect that I know will really boost the colors that you typically find in desert scenes. But instead of searching for it through the categories, I'm going to go to the search bar at the top here, and I'm just going to start typing the word desert. And so you can see here, there is our desert scene here. I'm also going to click on that flag, and what that flag is going to allow me to do is mark it as a favorite. I've been doing that more and more on my production machine, where if I see that I'm going to certain effects more routinely, I'll just click that flag, and now under the favorites we have a collection of what you use the most. So I'm going to just click on that, and it's going to apply. Now, like all effects, 100% is pretty much very strong, so what I'm going to do is bring that down to 0 here, and I'm going to bring it up about maybe 60%. Now, I don't like what it's doing to the sky, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my masking bug, I'm going to click on the image, I'm going to make it horizontal and just kind of bring it to the sky. I'm also going to take that feather right here, and I'm going to drop that down. It's another thing to notice. You used to have to either go to the pane over here or bring up an inspector to adjust that. We move that all up here to the tool options bar at the top. So I'm going to go here and just kind of bring it down right here, and now that I have that hard line, I'm going to take the feather and just bring it up a tiny bit until it blends a little bit nicer. Alright, so that's good. I'm going to hit add, and then we're going to create another effects layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the effects categories here, and we brought a kind of effect back from the old Photo Tools days. We used to have these paint-in brushes, and what the paint-in brushes allowed you to do is actually just start drawing an effect. You didn't have to apply it and invert it and go into a paint-in mode. And so I'm going to apply an effect here. Let me bring out the paint a little bit more, and then I'm also just go to the single column view. I like single column better. It's a little bit easier for me to see the effects, and I can make these thumbnails a little bit smaller. You'll know it's a paint-in brush because it'll have this little icon on the top left. So I'm going to click on brush more color. Now, you're going to get this warning. Just hit OK. It's basically saying this is a paint-in brush. So you draw where you want. You won't see anything. Now, I'm going to start with a large brush here. I'm going to just paint this effect through the sky. And you can see what it's doing. It's just adding a little bit of a saturation boost. Now, the problem that I always used to have whenever I'd get to an edge like this is getting the brush to not paint over the horizon. And so we have this new tool called the Perfect Brush. This is awesome. So what this allows me to do is it actually has edge detection. So you can see that as I'm drawing through, even though the brush is going over the edge, it's not actually, and let me turn on the mask so you can kind of see what I'm doing. It's not actually going over the edge. And so what you want to do is you want to draw over the colors that you want to mask. So you can see how I'm expanding that selection. And you can see how fast it's working. So it's really, really nice. All right, so there we go. Got that going. Let me turn the mask off. And we added some color here. And you can see that in this particular case, the default amount is 50%. That's something we're trying to do a better job of with Suite 7 is not bring every effect to 50. We're going to go through the effects and figure out what an optimal setting is. So I'm going to bring this down to 0. And I'm only going to do about maybe 30-ish%. So that's good there. And it applies really only to the sky. Let's hit add to add another layer. And this time I want to add a green enhancer. I love green enhancer. I use it all the time. So instead of hunting it down, again, I'm going to go to the search bar and I'm going to start typing the word green. And there is green enhancer right there. Let's make it a favorite and let's apply it. So green enhancer is applied to the whole image here, which I don't want. I'm going to go ahead first and change the overall hue of the green. And then I'm going to go and take the same magic desert effect that I had before, or I'm going to go to that layer. I'm going to go to the masking item, copy the mask, back to green enhancer, masking, paste mask. So it's going to remove it just from the sky, and it's only being applied here. Just like before, bring it to 0, and then slowly bring it up and stop where you're happy. So here, about 70-ish% is good. That's looking really good. Let's hit add. And now I'm going to go to one of my favorite effects that I use all the time. It's now under the contrast category. It's called Tonal Contrast. So I'm just going to scroll down. There's Tonal Contrast. And what that's doing is it's adding some texture to the scene. We'll bring this down to 0 and just very lightly bring out some of that texture. About 30% is more than enough, and I'm going to apply it globally to the whole scene. I like what it did to bring out texture throughout the scene. Hit add one more time and add one last effect. How I usually finish my effects, let's go to the search and type in the word deep, and then there's deep forest for my glow. I'm going to mark it as a favorite too. And you can see here if we go to the favorites, there are our favorites right there. All right, here, let's go and bring this down to 0. Let's bring it up a bit until we get this nice rich color. And then I'm going to go to the options pane here so that I can go to my blending options. And so I'm going to go here. You'll notice we have a lot of different blending options. We basically match what we had in Photoshop. I'm going to go to overlay, soft light, hard light. I like hard light. That's looking really nice. I might even make it a bit stronger. And then hit apply. So you can see if I toggle the before and the after, here's our before. Command P or Control P, or actually I forgot. We actually have now in Effects 4 a little checkbox right down there. So it's much easier to turn the preview. It's right over here, on and off. So nice. Again, this kind of goes back to the whole point of this episode. It's a nice flat image. We have good exposure everywhere. No stylization's done. It's just flat. But when you actually stylize, now you bring out the life and the character of the image. We still retained all of the character here, all of the details, but we added a little bit of style to it. So with this, I'm going to hit apply and return back to Lightroom to finish things off. All right, so here we are in Lightroom, and what I want to do is first, I usually go ahead and I first get my shadows, my highlights, and my black point done. I'm going to start with my white point. I'm going to press and hold the Option key or the Alt key, and while dragging, get it so that you can see here. If you start seeing these kind of dots, these color dots, that means that you're kind of clipping your highlights, or you're blowing them out rather. So I'm going to bring it until I barely see any dots. Black point, same thing. That's looking pretty good. And now let's go to the highlights and shadows. So with the highlights, I'm going to bring them down a bit because it's kind of hot over here. A lot of highlight. Shadows, we're in a good state. So here, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my graduated filter. I'm going to go to the exposure, make that kind of a little darker with some contrast. I'm going to bring that down over the sky. It's a bit too bright over there. I'm also going to drop the highlights in that area, and that's going to help kind of wrangle. Let me show this here, and so I can straighten it out a bit. And I'm also going to take it and move it down a bit. All right, that's looking better. All right, now I'm going to add just overall contrast to the scene here. Might even darken the scene just a tiny bit. I'm going to drop the saturation. It's a bit too punchy. but I'm going to bring up vibrance. And so that I find to be a nice balance of dropping saturation and increasing vibrance to get the right colors to come through. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to the hue, saturation, and luminance panel right here. I'm going to take the saturation, the little bumper, and I'm going to put it, or I think it's called the target adjustment tool. I'm going to put it over here, and I'm going to drop that down. I'm going to drop the saturation of the blue channel down over there just a bit, just because it was really popping out. Same thing over here. Just going to drop the yellows just a tiny bit. All right, so now we're getting there. I'm going to park the tool adjustment brush, or the target adjustment tool. I always get it mixed up. And then I'm going to go and add some clarity overall to the scene. So you can see here what we're getting, a really nice looking image. The last thing I'll do is I'll go ahead and add a tiny bit of a post-crop vignette to draw the eye further over here. And I'd say we're done. So you can see again just how much we were able to do because of tone mapping. Let's not forget, you know, the stylization really brought the image to life, but to give the image that body to build upon, that's where the tone mapping comes in. So I hope you give it a fair shake. There are tons of resources online to learn more about tone mapping and exposure blending, you know, and we do webinars on that all the time, and we have webinars recorded where we go through the stylization process. But I guess one of the points here is, you know, a lot of times we'll have people like Scott Kelby will mention something about HDR, and then everyone will jump down his throat. Or you might not agree with the way someone actually tone maps, or some people might want to use tone mapping as a stylization technique. That's fine. Just it's important to kind of have the whole picture. Don't just attack because you don't like it. Understand that it might not be for you, but it might be for someone else. There's always someone who will find a piece of art or some sort of work pleasant, visually pleasing. And so just go with an open mind. We really need to have a lot more tolerance with this kind of stuff, especially when HDR is it's a tool. So enough of that. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope it kind of gave you some more perspective. One thing to note about the preset download for this episode, you'll want to download it, but it will not work in Perfect Photo Suite 6 and Perfect Effects 3, which is the current versions that are out there right now. Download it, save it when we release Perfect Photo Suite 7, import it, and it'll work just fine. Granted, pretty much all of the things I did in Perfect Effects 4, you can do in Perfect Effects 3 with the same effects except the paint-in brush. But there you can just apply the more color effect, mask it, and you'll have the same effect if you don't want to wait. So with that, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you next week for episode number 26.